Extract from Fête Fatale by Sharon Bill. Paperback and ebook available from Amazon. There was hardly time for adulation as a pestering crowd urgently called for May's attention and demanded that she walk over to the poultry area. As they walked into the general hubbub, it seemed that feathers were getting a little ruffled in more ways than one, and the entries for the poultry competition were getting flustered, as John hadn't yet made his way to the allocated area. Nervous and irate poultry fanciers were bad enough, but nervous and irate poultry was a very sticky situation in all senses of the word. The hen husbands had kept their birds scrupulously clean and had left them at home until the last possible moment so as to not sully their appearance, but they'd been kept cooped up in small carrying cases and were showing no regard for the standards of hygiene that their owners strove to maintain. The situation needed to be dealt with quickly, and as it became apparent that John simply wasn't to be found, it was evident that a solution had to be sought quickly. The only options were to either cancel the competition, which was no solution at all, or to quickly find a substitute judge. An alternative judge needed to be found, and quickly, in order to placate the irate fowl fanciers. May quickly took hold of the situation, and Carlton was quickly dispatched to ask Dr. Wainwright to please step into the breach. He'd shown a polite interest in John's background reading into this topic. In fact, he'd positively encouraged him in his research, as he wanted to promote his positive pursuits to alleviate his stress. He was a highly regarded figure in the community and could command respect, and he was also walking towards them at that moment. May quickly secured his services without giving him time to consider his options, and so he tried to mentally adjust to his newfound position as the poultry entrants were lined up ready for inspection. "He doesn't know a bantam from a barn owl," grumbled Mike. However, when it was explained to him that the only alternative was for him to withdraw his own candidate and act as judge himself, he quietly took his place in the line-up. They were deprived of the opportunity to test the mettle of Dr. Wainwright's poultry judging ability by the arrival of a most breathless Betty. She was so agitated and flustered that it was difficult at first to grasp what she was saying. May steeled herself for the onslaught. This really wasn't the time for a Betty episode. She took a deep breath and, as patiently as she could manage, she asked, "What is it, Betty? What's the matter?" I've found him, he's dead." May barely managed to conceal a sigh of irritability and asked again, "What are you on about? Are you talking about John? Is he ill?" At this point, Dr. Wainwright intervened, and feeling himself to be in a situation that he was far more able to cope with, he took control. "Where is John, Betty? Perhaps you'd better take me to him." Turning to May, he said, "It's best that everybody stays here. John won't want a crowd about him if he's not well. His sugar levels have been unpredictable recently, so perhaps he's had a relapse." Turning to Carlton, he continued, "Could you please come with me, and would you arrange for Jean to be brought over here? She may be needed." Then, turning his attention back to Betty, he said, "Thank you for finding John. Please take me to him." "He's on a chair by the dustbins at the back of the village hall, where people sit if they want to smoke," said Betty. "But John doesn't smoke, does he? He's dead, I tell you. I can see that for myself." Betty marched off at a surprising pace, heading towards the village hall. Carlton and Dr. Wainwright followed closely behind her. They didn't speak as they walked, but exchanged a questioning glance. They could only guess at what they'd find. The question that was uppermost in both their minds was, why was John sitting next to the dustbins in the first place? As they turned the corner to the rear of the village hall, they were struck by the sight of John Barlow, gazing unseeing into the glaring sunshine. He was leaning back in the plastic patio chair, his arms hanging limply down by his sides. Dr. Wainwright moved towards him to test for a pulse, but it didn't need a doctor to make a correct medical diagnosis. Betty was right. John Barlow was dead. The general atmosphere of the continuing fête was untouched by the death of John Barlow. and as Dr. Wainwright walked into the crowd, the atmosphere of an ongoing holiday was refreshing. There was an unofficial gathering at the cakes and preserves stalls, and the hot topic of joint first prize had been superseded by news of the death. General milling around and subdued chatter rippled under the external noise of the fête. A separate bubble had formed a nucleus within the festivities as people quietly discussed the tragedy and what bearing that might have on the day. Nobody was certain what they ought to do next. As they were discussing matters, Fred Bruff's men carried John's body away. It was a discordant sight, the dark jackets and striped trousers of the funeral garb in the midst of the holiday apparel of the fête. The festivities were due to end soon, and the Templeton singers had planned to round off the day by singing Jerusalem, with the Mossleigh WI joining with them. There didn't seem to be any reason why this shouldn't go ahead as planned, and so the singers began to make their way to the area where Richard was waiting at the keyboard. Jonty and his chums had torn themselves away from the Badger and, after glancing approval from May, looked over the music on the keyboard stand to check which key to play in before they took up their positions to join in. Everyone was surprised to see Jean take her place in the alto section, but her neighbours quickly shuffled aside to make room for her. With a gentle squeeze on his shoulder, they then joined the rest of the choir to watch May's baton for the downbeat to start singing. Music ever was a restorative to the soul, and in the light of recent events there was more than one dewy eye in both the choir and the audience. Nathaniel, Matt, Drew and Terry had joined the crowd on hearing the news, and the music united them all in their sorrow. It uplifted and encouraged them too. It seemed a fitting tribute to both the close of the fête and also a suitable impromptu memorial service to John Barlow, who had been liked by all. The only member who looked resolutely unmoved was Jean. In her newly acquired widow status, she appeared frostier than ever. It would affect her more deeply, no doubt, and who could tell how grief could affect those it touched most. If anything, this made her plight all the more sorrowful and caused her to look more fragile than any demonstrative outpouring of grief ever could. As the last instrumental strains of the coda faded away, Jean's friends led her kindly back to the village hall. There didn't seem much more that they could do. Brass band had always deeply affected Beth. The piercing tones of the trombone touched her to the core. She always thought that the trombone had a plaintive timbre, and now she was crying openly. Drew came alongside her and embraced her, letting her tears naturally ebb away. After a moment's pause, the spell broke and the people began to drift away. The fête was nearly over, and Eileen and Betty volunteered to escort Jean home, thinking it not right that she face an empty house alone just now. The rest of the WI stayed behind to begin the Herculean task of tidying up once the final visitors had left.